My adventure began early in the morning in Houston, but by mid-afternoon, Kyle and I were at the trailhead heading to camp. The familiar mountain air and smells greeted me on the trail, my body struggling to remember the balance of the motorcycle and the rhythm of riding down these trails. It had been nearly 3 years since I had been here last. We finally reached the pass, and despite my absence from the mountains over the last few years, I felt immediately at home. Back into this place where life is put back into perspective, and all of the distractions and stressors of everyday life simply melt away. I couldn't help but stop and take a moment to take it back in, to see the familiar peaks and ridges, the patches of green timber, and those large swaths of burn where majestic pines once stood. Now only the ghostly shells of those left charred and standing, still fighting to defy gravity. After a nearly 2-hour ride, I'd finally made it back to my second home. Nothing beats the view from the back porch, $1 million view if I ever saw one. Or the satisfaction of taking a midday nap under its shade. Of course, this is grizzly country, and this bear decided that the archery target had surely been left out just for him. There wasn't much left of the targets after he was done, but with a little ingenuity and a roll of T-Rex tape, Jonathan was able to patch together a pretty solid target from all the scraps. We left an old can of bear spray on top of the target just in case the bear decided to come back for round 2. The bear never returned to the target, but a few days later Jonathan connected with the can from nearly 100 yards, shooting at the target for practice. There's a large ridge that looms over camp. That nearby ridge has always stood as a boundary, a challenge that none of us would take on, knowing the sore muscles and joints that would follow and hinder the next day's hunt. But Jonathan, undeterred, took up the challenge and scaled up the ridge to peer over to the wilderness area beyond. The jagged rock faces and gusting winds seemed inhospitable, but it was in fact home to mountain goats and bighorn sheep. Later in the hunt we saw about 30 mountain goats bedded down along one end of this ridge. In the distance, he could see the plumes of smoke billowing from one of Montana's forest fires, still burning and smoldering. Deemed to have been started by natural causes, the firefighters hung back and watched as thousands of acres burned. Well, it was time to get back to work. Kyle, Jonathan, and I each left camp every morning in search of elk or wolves. I would leave camp to hunt an area in the morning, walking, listening, glassing, and calling to get within bow range of an elk. I had many encounters and several very close calls, but hadn't quite put it all together yet. Most afternoons I would still hunt a mineral lick and wallow that elk and mule deer frequently visit. I had seen elk and mule deer on several occasions on these afternoon hunts, but hadn't yet had a bull come in. It was the 9th day of my hunt and the last afternoon hunt that I would be able to make before heading back home. I heard a bugle nearby and decided to try some cow calling. The bull responded several times, but I could tell he was moving through and already past the mineral lick. It wasn't the bugling bull, but minutes later a spike appeared at the edge of the mineral lick. He stopped for a few seconds, seemingly a little nervous, and moved on, presumably to join back up with the moving herd. After a few more minutes, this bull appeared, coming up the hill from below. He was a young 5x6, and my pulse quickened as he stepped closer to the wallow. My excitement soon turned to dejection as he paused briefly and continued up the hill behind some trees. As I considered my next move, I caught more movement from below the hill. Another bull appeared and started approaching as before. The 4x5 edged into the wallow and started drinking. I ranged him at 40 yards and waited for him to present a better shot, and for him to clear a large patch of grass that was blocking my view of his vitals. He finally came into the clear at my expected shot window at 36 yards, but he was quartering towards me and looking in my direction. With my bow in hand, I was waiting for him to look back to draw, but instead he started walking up the hill. It was now or never. I drew back and I edged forward on my folding stool. He must have caught movement or heard the stool creaking, but he stopped and looked back. Just then I settled my 45-yard pin behind his shoulder and muscle memory took over, sending the arrow flying off my string. The shot was right on the money. He stumbled as he went through the timber above the wallow and reappeared down the hill. He staggered and fell within sight. Man, I couldn't believe it. 11 years and several elk trips had passed since I had taken my first bull, and I had finally succeeded in doing it again. I was just overjoyed. I thank God for this magnificent animal and for the ability and opportunity to hunt them in these mountains. The light disappeared as I was relishing in the moment, and then reality struck. We needed to get to work, so I scrambled to get my things and get back to the motorcycle to share the good news back at camp. He may not make the trophy books, but there is no question that this elk is a trophy in my book. We made pretty quick work of the bull, working in the dark with only our headlamps, and returned back to camp at about 1:30 a.m. with full loads of meat on the rock-ons. My adventure had come to an end. As I boarded my flight the next day and started my way back home, I reflected on how blessed we were to enjoy these wonderful mountains and forests, to chase these magnificent animals and experience so many more that call these mountains home, to get away and reconnect with friends, with myself, and with God, to reflect on the things that actually matter in life, and to return ready to embrace those loved ones waiting back home. I reflected back on all of the beginnings. A beginning adventure for Jonathan, his first trip to elk camp. The beginning of Kyle's obsession and relentless pursuit of elk some 30 years ago in these same mountains. The beginning of a passion and obsession that started in me 13 years ago in these mountains. And all of those beginnings, and countless more, all thanks to one man. That man chased these elk with help of his trusty set of mules well before me. He thrived in these mountains and cherished his summers chasing trout in these clear streams and sharing elk hunting stories over a hot cup of coffee and Navajo bread. His great journey on this earth came to an end this year, but all of those beginnings remain. We'll miss you, my friend.